Gangnam Nights, Neon Rain Episode 1. There are over 9 million people living in Seoul. On one rainy night, two strangers crossed the same street. Neither knew the other's name. Neither expected to ever meet again. But somewhere above them, a camera captured a single photograph. By sunrise, the entire city believed it had witnessed the beginning of a love story. They were wrong. This isn't the story of a photograph. It's the story of two ordinary lives, caught inside an extraordinary rumor. One woman searching for a place to belong. One man carrying the weight of an empire. One rainy night. That changes everything. Welcome to Gangnam Nights, Neon Rain. And remember, not every story begins with love. Some begin with a single act of kindness. It's the beginning of a love story. Chapter 1. The city before sunrise. Every city keeps two versions of itself. There is the city the tourists photograph. The city of glittering skylines, luxury storefronts, crowded cafes, and perfect sunsets reflected across polished glass. Then there is the city that belongs only to the people who wake before dawn. The bakers whose ovens begin warming long before the streets fill with footsteps. The subway operators who guide empty trains beneath sleeping neighborhoods. The cafe owners arranging chairs while the sky is still a deep shade of blue. The elderly women watering flowers before the first commuter notices they exist. That is the Seoul few visitors ever meet. That is the Seoul that knows everyone's secrets. Gangnam awakened slowly. The towers of polished steel caught the earliest traces of morning, while narrow side streets remained wrapped in shadow. Delivery trucks rolled quietly through alleyways. Bicycle tires whispered across damp pavement. Somewhere in the distance, a train slipped beneath the city, its low rumble blending into the steady heartbeat of another ordinary weekday. Ordinary. The word meant something different to every person living there. For some, it meant another board meeting. For others, another school day. Another rent payment. Another cup of coffee. Another chance to begin again. Across the city, two lives were moving toward the same morning without the slightest awareness of one another. Neither believed this day would become memorable. History rarely announced itself in advance. It simply arrived dressed as an ordinary Tuesday. 47 floors above Gangnam, Seo Ji-woo stood alone before a wall of glass. The city stretched beneath him like an architect's model. Perfectly ordered. Perfectly distant. The first light of dawn reflected from hundreds of office windows, transforming entire buildings into pillars of pale gold. His office remained almost silent. A leather notebook rested beside a fountain pen. No family photographs. No unnecessary decoration. Only space. Only order. His father had once told him that a clear desk encouraged clear decisions. Ji-woo had inherited both the desk and the expectation that came with it. A quiet knock broke the silence. Director Han entered carrying 2 cups of coffee. Not because Ji-woo had requested one. Because he never needed to. You were here before sunrise again. Ji-woo accepted the paper cup with a grateful nod. So were you. Director Han smiled. Someone has to make sure you remember breakfast. They stood together before the windows. Neither man hurried to speak. Some conversations improved when allowed to arrive on their own. You've been spending more time looking outside. Ji-woo watched the city below. I've spent years looking at reports. And now? I think I've forgotten what those reports are supposed to protect. Director Han said nothing. Sometimes wisdom required silence more than advice. Several kilometers away, another beginning quietly unfolded. The airport shuttle eased to a stop. Passengers gathered their luggage with the familiar mixture of excitement and exhaustion shared by everyone arriving in a new country. Among them stood Amara Ellis. 26 years old. A designer. A dreamer. A woman carrying more sketchbooks than shoes. She adjusted the strap of her worn leather tote and looked through the rain-speckled window at the skyline beyond. This was Seoul. Not the version she had imagined from magazines or travel documentaries. The real city. Clouds drifted lazily above distant rooftops. Apartment buildings stood beside glass towers. Old brick storefronts leaned comfortably against modern cafes. Nothing appeared staged. Everything appeared alive. She smiled. Not because the city was perfect. Because it wasn't. Perfection had never interested her. Possibility did. The shuttle doors opened with a soft hiss. Cool autumn air greeted her for the first time. She stepped onto Korean soil carrying 2 suitcases. 1 sketchbook. And more hope than certainty. She could not know it then. But before the week ended, the city would know her name. Long before it knew her heart. Fade gently into the next chapter. Chapter 2. Apartment 401. There is an old Korean saying that every home remembers the footsteps of the people who enter it. Some footsteps arrive carrying joy. Others arrive carrying grief. Most simply arrive carrying ordinary life. Apartment 401 had been waiting. The taxi left Amara at the foot of a modest 4-story brick building tucked between a neighborhood cafe and a tiny stationery shop. It wasn't remarkable enough to appear in travel guides. There were no polished marble entrances or uniformed doormen. The brass numbers beside the entrance had softened with age, and climbing ivy had claimed one corner of the outer wall as though the building itself had decided nature made better decoration than paint. Amara stood quietly for a moment. This was home now. Not forever. Not yet. But for the first time since leaving Jamaica, she allowed herself to imagine unpacking instead of simply arriving. She pulled 1 suitcase onto the sidewalk. Then the second. The wheels bumped awkwardly against the uneven paving stones. Before she could lift the heavier case onto the first step, another pair of hands reached for the handle. No. A gentle voice. Together. Amara looked up. The woman standing beside her was small in stature, but carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who had spent a lifetime caring for other people. Her silver hair was gathered neatly at the back of her head. A soft cream cardigan rested over a pale blue blouse, and a faded floral apron suggested she had left something cooking only moments before. Her smile appeared before her words. You knew. Amara smiled back. I am. The older woman nodded as though confirming something she had suspected all morning. Apartment 401. Yes. Another nod. Then she lifted one end of the suitcase before Amara had the chance to protest. Together. The climb suddenly became much easier. The hallways smelled faintly of cedar wood and freshly brewed tea. Sunlight filtered through narrow windows, warming the honey-colored floorboards that creaked softly beneath their footsteps. The older woman stopped outside apartment 402. She pointed first to her own door, then to the one directly opposite. You. Apartment 401. She reached into the pocket of her apron and produced a small key attached to a wooden tag. The landlord had apparently entrusted it to her. She placed it gently into Amara's hand with surprising ceremony. Welcome. One simple word. Yet it carried more comfort than the long farewell speeches exchanged at the airport. Amara bowed slightly. Thank you. The woman returned the bow, then tapped her own chest. Park. A pause. Mrs. Park. I'm Amara. Mrs. Park repeated the name carefully. Ma-R-A. She smiled proudly after getting it right. Beautiful. Apartment 401 greeted Amara with quiet simplicity. Morning light poured through a large east-facing window overlooking the neighborhood below. The living room was modest. A wooden table stood beside the window. 2 chairs. A comfortable sofa. Bookshelves waiting to be filled. The kitchen occupied one corner beneath open shelves of warm oak. The bedroom was small but peaceful, with enough room for a bed, a wardrobe, and a writing desk already positioned beneath another window. Nothing felt luxurious. Everything felt intentional. The apartment did not impress. It welcomed. Amara walked slowly from room to room. She touched the windowsill, opened the wardrobe, ran her fingertips lightly across the grain of the wooden table. Every new home carried a brief moment when it waited to discover the person moving into it. She wondered what this apartment expected of her. Perhaps only that she stay a while. A gentle knock interrupted her thoughts. 3 soft taps. When Amara opened the door, Mrs. Park stood there holding a small lacquered tray, 2 steaming cups, a teapot, and a plate of warm rice cakes dusted lightly with soybean powder. For moving. Mrs. Park smiled. You tired? I probably am. Mrs. Park laughed at the answer even though she understood only part of it. Some meanings traveled farther than language. They sat together beside the open window while the afternoon breeze drifted through lace curtains. Below them, the neighborhood moved with its own unhurried rhythm. Children walked home from school. The cafe owner swept fallen leaves from the entrance. A florist arranged buckets of chrysanthemums beneath a striped awning. Mrs. Park poured tea with practiced hands, never spilling a drop, never rushing. Amara watched quietly. My grandmother made tea like that. Mrs. Park looked up. Grandmother. Amara nodded. In Jamaica. Mrs. Park placed one hand over her heart, then smiled. Same. No elaborate conversation followed. None was needed. 2 women from opposite sides of the world sat together in peaceful silence, discovering that kindness required remarkably little translation. Outside, a light breeze stirred the chrysanthemums below. Neither woman noticed. But somewhere across Gangnam, the first clouds of the coming storm had already begun gathering beyond the skyline. Not every storm announced itself with thunder. Some arrived gently, just like new neighbors. Chapter 3. The city that teaches you its name. Every city has 2 maps. There is the map printed on paper. The one tourists fold into their pockets, tracing train lines and famous landmarks with hopeful fingers. Then there is the invisible map. The one built from favorite cafes. Morning greetings. Bookstores remembered by smell instead of address. The shortcut home that only feels like home after walking it enough times. That second map can never be purchased. It must be lived. Amara's first morning in Gangnam began before sunrise. Habit. Not necessity. Back in Jamaica, mornings had belonged to birdsong drifting through open windows and the distant rhythm of waves carried inland by the wind. Seoul sounded different. The city awakened in layers. A delivery scooter hummed somewhere below. Metal shutters rolled upward one storefront at a time. Someone laughed in the alley. A train murmured beneath the streets like distant thunder. She stood at the apartment window with a mug of coffee warming both hands. The unfamiliar sounds no longer felt foreign, only unexplored. The neighborhood cafe was already open. The owner looked up the moment she entered. You are new. His English carried the careful confidence of someone who practiced it every day. I arrived yesterday. Then today. He smiled while preparing coffee. You become a regular. Amara laughed. I haven't ordered yet. You will. He pointed toward the chalkboard menu without looking. Americano. She blinked. How did you know? You looked at the espresso machine before you looked at the pastries. He shrugged. Cafe owners notice things. He handed her the coffee. And neighbors. That last word lingered with her long after she stepped back onto the sidewalk. Neighbor. Not customer. Not visitor. Neighbor. The streets invited wandering. Not with grand monuments. With details. A flower shop where chrysanthemums spilled onto the pavement in cheerful clusters of white and gold. A tiny stationery store displaying fountain pens beneath warm amber lights. A bakery whose open door filled the block with the scent of butter and sweet red bean bread. Every few steps she found another reason to slow down. So she did. She sketched a weathered doorway wrapped in ivy. She photographed an elderly man repairing umbrellas beneath a striped canvas awning. She paused beside a narrow alley where rows of paper lanterns swayed gently overhead despite the still morning air. The alley seemed to breathe. A small wooden sign hung beside the entrance. Lantern Alley. The words were simple. The feeling wasn't. The stone beneath her shoes had been polished smooth by generations of footsteps. Independent cafes nestled comfortably beside ceramic workshops. Music drifted from somewhere unseen. Nothing asked for attention. Everything rewarded it. Amara smiled. Some places didn't announce themselves. They waited to be discovered. Halfway down the alley, she found the bookstore. Its front window displayed no bestsellers. Only carefully chosen books arranged beside handwritten recommendation cards. The brass bell above the door chimed softly as she entered. The smell greeted her first. Old paper. Fresh tea. Cedar shelves warmed by decades of afternoon sunlight. It reminded her of libraries she had loved as a child. The bookseller looked up from a stack of newly arrived novels. He smiled before speaking. You found us. The sentence caught her by surprise. I wasn't looking. Exactly. He closed the book in his hands. People who are looking usually walk past. She laughed quietly. And people who aren't? They tend to stay. She wandered slowly between the shelves. Books filled every wall from floor to ceiling. Some carried crisp new jackets. Others leaned comfortably with worn spines that suggested many previous readers. She stopped before a collection of Korean folk tales translated into English. Beside it rested a volume of poetry. Then a beautifully illustrated book on traditional textile patterns. Without realizing it, she had gathered 3 books against her chest. The bookseller appeared beside her carrying 2 cups of steaming barley tea. You've chosen well. I haven't decided. He handed her 1 cup. Tea helps. She accepted it with a grateful smile. I didn't order this. I know. He gestured toward a small reading table beside the rain-speckled window. Books ask for time. So does tea. Outside, the first clouds drifted across the autumn sky. Inside, time slowed almost imperceptibly. Amara opened the textile book first. Each page revealed centuries of craftsmanship stitched into silk and linen. Patterns carried stories. Colors carried history. She copied several motifs into her sketchbook, not to reproduce them, but to remember how they made her feel. The bookseller noticed without interrupting. He had learned long ago that readers often spoke most honestly through the books they chose. When Amara finally looked up, she realized nearly 2 hours had passed. I've been here that long? The bookseller smiled. That's usually how people know they'll come back. I've been here that long? She glanced once more around the shop. I think you're right. I rarely am. He laughed softly. But the books usually are. When she stepped back into Lantern Alley, the clouds had thickened. The air carried the faint scent of approaching rain. She tucked the wrapped books carefully into her tote beside her sketchbook, then looked back toward the bookstore. For reasons she couldn't yet explain, it already felt familiar. Not because she had spent hours there, because she had been welcomed there. There is a difference. As she disappeared into the afternoon crowd, the bookseller watched from the doorway. He had seen countless strangers pass through Lantern Alley over the years. Most remained strangers. A few quietly became part of the neighborhood. He suspected the young woman with the sketchbook belonged to the second kind. Above the rooftops, the first dark cloud crossed the sun. Gangnam barely noticed. The city had seen many storms. It simply didn't know yet that this one would begin with a photograph. If you enjoyed this story, please like, subscribe, and turn on notifications for more original cinematic audiobooks from Gold Thread Studios. Leave a comment below. Do you think one photograph can change two lives forever? Thank you for listening. Every thread tells a story. Chapter 4. The Weight of Glass. Glass remembers everything. Morning sunlight. Fingerprints. Rain. The reflection of a face standing quietly before it. Kongjin Tower was built almost entirely from glass. Some called it beautiful. Seo Ji-woo sometimes wondered whether beauty and transparency were the same thing. From the executive floor, Seoul stretched to the horizon. The Han River caught the afternoon light like a ribbon of brushed silver. Construction cranes marked neighborhoods that would look different 5 years from now. The city never truly stopped rebuilding itself. Neither, he suspected, did the people living inside it. The boardroom filled slowly. Directors arrived with tablets, reports, and carefully prepared opinions. Coffee was poured. Screens awakened. Quarterly projections appeared across the wall. Numbers. Charts. Growth. Risk. Opportunity. The language of corporations rarely changed. Ji-woo listened more than he spoke. When he finally did speak, the room instinctively became still. What happens to the bookstore? Several directors looked at one another. The bookstore. The redevelopment district. He touched the map projected onto the wall. Lantern Alley. One executive adjusted his glasses. It will likely relocate. Likely? There isn't enough commercial value to justify. Ji-woo interrupted gently. I didn't ask about commercial value. He looked around the room. I asked what happens to the bookstore. Silence. Director Han watched quietly from the far end of the table. A small smile almost reached his face. Almost. The meeting ended an hour later. The redevelopment proposal remained unsigned. Several executives left frustrated. Others simply thoughtful. Director Han walked beside Ji-woo toward the elevators. You surprised them. They should be surprised. They've never heard anyone ask about a bookstore before approving a tower. Ji-woo looked toward the windows. My father used to say. He paused. If you erase enough small places, eventually the city forgets how to be human. Director Han nodded. He did say that. They stood together for a moment, watching people cross the streets far below. They'll think you're becoming sentimental. Ji-woo smiled faintly. I hope not. Why? Because I'm becoming observant. At nearly the same hour, Amara stood inside Studio Hanul for the first time. The converted warehouse hummed with quiet industry. Steam curled upward from pressing stations. Patterned paper covered broad wooden tables. Music drifted softly from an old speaker perched above shelves overflowing with folded fabric. The room smelled of cotton, coffee, and possibility. Lee Soo-jin greeted her with a firm handshake. Welcome to Studio Hanul. The words carried none of the formal distance Amara expected. Instead, they sounded like an invitation. I've admired your portfolio. I'm honored. Soo-jin smiled. Don't be. She gestured toward the studio. Now we get to find out who you really are. The introductions came naturally. Pattern makers. Sample machinists. Textile specialists. Junior designers balancing coffee cups and measuring tapes with equal skill. Someone pointed her toward an empty desk beside the tall windows. Another handed her a sketchbook embossed with the studio's name. She thanked them warmly, then quietly placed her own worn sketchbook beside it. The two books rested side by side. One brand new. One softened by years of use. She smiled. There was room in her life for both. By late afternoon, Soo-jin gathered the team around a large inspiration wall. Fabric swatches. Photographs. Architectural sketches. Fragments of poems. Old subway tickets. Pressed flowers. The wall looked chaotic. Until one looked closely. "What do you see?" Soo-jin asked. Several designers answered. Color. Texture. Movement. She turned toward Amara. "And you?" Amara studied the wall for a long moment. "I see people." The room became quiet. She stepped closer. "The flowers remind me someone walked through a park." She pointed toward a faded ticket. "Someone kept this because the journey mattered." Then the fabric. "Someone touched this before deciding it belonged." She looked back at Soo-jin. "I don't think inspiration comes from objects. It comes from the people who leave pieces of themselves behind." No one spoke. Finally, Soo-jin smiled. "I was hoping you'd say something like that." Outside, the afternoon had begun changing. The brilliant blue sky slowly surrendered to gathering clouds. The breeze carried the unmistakable scent of approaching rain. Shopkeepers stepped outside to move displays beneath awnings. Cyclists glanced upward. The florist covered delicate bouquets with clear plastic sheets. The bookseller looked through his front window toward the darkening sky, then quietly set a kettle on the stove. Rain always brought readers. 47 floors above the streets, Ji-woo closed the final folder of the day. He loosened his tie, walked once more to the great wall of glass. The first raindrop struck the window, then another. Tiny circles spread across the surface before merging into slow silver streams. Below, umbrellas began opening like flowers across the sidewalks of Gangnam. Across the district, Amara paused beneath the entrance of Studio Hanol. She looked upward. The first cool drops touched her face. Instead of running, she smiled. Somewhere between Kangjin Tower, Studio Hanol, Lantern Alley, and Apartment 401, the city had reached the precise moment when ordinary days quietly become unforgettable. Neither of them knew it. But the rain had arrived, and with it, the beginning of their story. Chapter 5. Neon Rain. Rain transformed Gangnam with astonishing speed. Within minutes, polished sidewalks became mirrors. Neon signs stretched into long ribbons of crimson, sapphire, and gold across the wet pavement. Cafe windows glowed warmer. Conversations moved indoors. The city that had spent all afternoon looking toward the sky now lowered its head and simply kept moving. Seoul understood rain. No one complained. They adjusted. Umbrellas opened. Jackets were buttoned. Life continued. Amara remained beneath the awning outside Studio Hanol. Several coworkers hurried toward the subway station. One called over a shoulder. "Wait 10 minutes. It'll pass." She smiled. "I don't mind." That answer earned a few puzzled looks. One designer laughed. "You'll learn." About the rain? No. He pointed toward the crowded intersection. About Seoul. They disappeared into the curtain of water. Amara stayed where she was. The scent of wet pavement carried her somewhere else. For a fleeting moment, she was 8 years old again, standing on the veranda of her grandmother's house in rural Jamaica, watching warm rain dance across banana leaves while her grandmother stitched beside an open window. Never rush because of rain, her grandmother had once told her. Rain only asks you to notice the world a little longer. She smiled at the memory, then stepped into the storm. Her umbrella remained folded inside her tote. Not because she had forgotten it, because she wanted to feel the rain for just another minute. Cool drops settled on her sleeves. A breeze carried the fragrance of roasted chestnuts from a nearby street vendor. Traffic lights shimmered in the growing darkness. She walked slowly, sketchbook tucked safely beneath her coat, one hand resting against it almost unconsciously. Across Gangnam, Ji-woo exited Kongjin Tower later than usual. His driver waited beneath the covered entrance. The rear door stood open. Ji-woo looked toward the rain, then closed the door gently. "I'll walk." The driver hesitated. "It's nearly 2 kilometers. I know." "I'll follow." Ji-woo nodded. At a distance. The sedan eased quietly into traffic while he disappeared beneath a large black umbrella. This had become a habit over the past year. Walking reminded him that cities were measured by people, not skylines. The intersection ahead filled with umbrellas moving in every direction. The pedestrian signal remained red. People gathered patiently beneath glowing advertisements that reflected from the rain-soaked street. A young father lifted his sleeping daughter higher onto his shoulder. An office worker shared half an umbrella with a complete stranger. A florist protected a bucket of white chrysanthemums with more care than she gave herself. Ji-woo watched them all. Small acts of consideration. Invisible to headlines. Essential to a city. Across the opposite curb, Amara arrived just as the pedestrian signal began its countdown. She slipped her umbrella from the tote. A sudden gust caught it before she could open it. The umbrella twisted awkwardly. She laughed at herself. The woman beside her smiled. Without a word, she helped straighten one of the bent ribs. A simple gesture. Finished in seconds. "Thank you." The woman bowed lightly. Then the crossing signal changed. The crowd moved as one. Hundreds of footsteps echoed softly against rain-darkened asphalt. Umbrellas drifted together like a slow-moving tide. Halfway across, another gust swept between the buildings. Someone stumbled. The movement rippled through the crowd. Amara instinctively stepped aside to avoid colliding with an elderly man whose cane had slipped against the wet pavement. At the same instant, Ji-woo reached forward from the opposite direction, steadying the man's elbow before he could fall. For a heartbeat. The two strangers stood on either side of the old man. Neither noticed the other. Both were looking only at him. "Are you all right?" Amara asked. The gentleman smiled. "Just my pride." Ji-woo returned the smile. "I think that's still intact." The old man chuckled. So far. The traffic signal continued counting down. The crowd flowed around them. Satisfied that the gentleman was steady once more, they each stepped back. She continued toward the eastern sidewalk. He toward the west. Neither looked over a shoulder. Neither searched for another glance. Sometimes kindness asks for nothing beyond the moment itself. High above the intersection, inside the second floor of a coffee shop, a freelance photographer lowered his camera after firing a short burst of images through the rain-streaked glass. He reviewed them casually. Most were ordinary. Blurred umbrellas. Headlights. Traffic. Then one frame caught his attention. A man in a dark overcoat. A young woman holding a sketchbook close beneath her coat. Standing close enough to appear together. The elderly gentleman between them had stepped just beyond the edge of the frame. Perspective erased him completely. The photograph suggested something that had never happened. The photographer tilted his head. Interesting. He saved the image. Not because he believed it told the truth. Because he suspected someone else might pay for the story it appeared to tell. The rain continued falling. The crowd dispersed into countless different lives. Amara reached apartment 401 smiling quietly to herself, thinking only of the elderly gentleman who had joked about his pride. Ji-woo arrived home reflecting on his father's words about cities and the people who quietly held them together. Neither thought about the other. Neither imagined they had shared the same moment. Above the city, the storm slowly drifted east. Behind it, clear skies waited patiently. But inside one camera, a single frozen instant had already begun a journey that would soon travel farther than either of them ever intended. The rain had ended. The story had not. Chapter 6. The morning after the rain. Morning carried no memory of the storm. The sidewalks had dried beneath a clear autumn sky. Window cleaners wiped away the final traces of rain from the glass towers of Gangnam. Cafe owners arranged outdoor tables once again. Cyclists reclaimed the streets. The city behaved as though nothing unusual had happened. Cities are remarkably good at forgetting weather. They are far less successful at forgetting stories. Amara woke before her alarm. Sunlight spilled across the wooden floor of apartment 401, settling gently over the sketchbook she had left beside the window the night before. She stretched slowly. For the first time since arriving in Seoul, she had slept without waking in the middle of the night. Something inside her had begun relaxing. Perhaps it was the neighborhood. Perhaps it was Mrs. Park. Perhaps it was simply the realization that this unfamiliar city had started feeling less unfamiliar. 3 soft knocks interrupted her thoughts. She smiled immediately. Mrs. Park. When the door opened, the older woman stood waiting with 2 steaming bowls balanced carefully on a wooden tray. Breakfast. Amara laughed. You really aren't going to let me go hungry. Mrs. Park nodded very seriously. No. Then her face softened into a grin. You work. You eat. Good balance. They shared breakfast beside the open window while the neighborhood gradually awakened below them. A flower delivery arrived for the florist. The cafe owner greeted regular customers by name. Someone walked a golden retriever that insisted on stopping every few steps to inspect fallen leaves. Mrs. Park watched the little dog disappear around the corner. Happy. She said it almost to herself. Amara followed her gaze. He does seem happy. Mrs. Park looked at her. So should you. Across Gangnam, the photograph appeared online for the first time. It wasn't published by a newspaper, or a television station, or anyone particularly important. It appeared on a celebrity gossip account that survived by asking questions it rarely bothered to answer. The caption was brief. Who is the woman beside Kang Jin's heir? Within minutes, comments began appearing. Isn't that director Seo? Maybe she's an actress. She looks foreign. Anyone know her? Most people scrolled past without another thought. A few lingered. One person saved the image. Another enlarged it. Another shared it with a friend. No avalanche begins as an avalanche. It begins as a single stone moving quietly downhill. 47 floors above the streets, Ji-woo entered his office carrying the morning reports. His assistant placed a stack of newspapers beside the coffee waiting on his desk. There is one more thing. He looked up. An online article. She slid a tablet across the polished wood. The photograph filled the screen. Ji-woo studied it silently. He recognized the intersection immediately. Then the rain. Then the elderly gentleman whose fall had never happened. Except, the old man wasn't there. The frame had erased him completely. Only two figures remained. A woman with a sketchbook. A man holding an umbrella. The story written beneath the image had nothing to do with what actually happened. He looked at his assistant. Has anyone verified this? No. Because there is nothing to verify. He returned the tablet. It was a crowded crosswalk. Exactly. His assistant hesitated. Should communications respond? Ji-woo looked once more at the photograph. No. Why not? Because the moment we answer. He folded the newspaper neatly. We teach people that fiction deserves a press conference. Director Han entered a few moments later. Without asking permission. He rarely needed to. You've seen it. Ji-woo nodded. It isn't true. I know. The older man sat across from him. But truth and attention have never been close relatives. Ji-woo allowed himself a small smile. I've missed your optimism. Director Han smiled back. I left it at home. Meanwhile, Studio Hanul welcomed another ordinary workday. Steam rose from pressing stations. Music drifted softly through the workroom. Patterned paper covered nearly every available surface. Amara greeted her coworkers with growing confidence. She had begun remembering names, learning routines, understanding the gentle rhythm that held the studio together. Lee Soo-jin noticed immediately. You look different. Amara paused. Different. Less like someone visiting. She smiled. Good. Why? Because visitors eventually leave. Amara looked around the studio. Sunlight pouring through tall industrial windows. Fabric hanging in careful rows. People laughing while arguing over stitching details. She realized she wanted to stay. Not forever. But long enough to become part of the place. I think. She smiled quietly. I'm beginning to belong. Soo-jin nodded once. I thought so. Several kilometers away, inside a small apartment overlooking another corner of Seoul, freelance photographer Kang Dae-ho refreshed the gossip page. The photograph had already gathered thousands of views. More than any image he had sold that month. His phone rang. The editor's voice arrived before a greeting. Nice work. Dae-ho looked at the photograph again. It isn't really what happened. The editor laughed. It doesn't have to be. The line went dead. Dae-ho remained staring at the screen. For reasons he couldn't explain. The victory felt strangely hollow. Outside, sunlight reflected brightly from the windows of Kongjin Tower. Inside Studio Hanul, Amara laughed with colleagues over coffee. In apartment 402, Mrs. Park carefully watered her chrysanthemums. Life continued with reassuring normality. None of them knew that somewhere inside thousands of phones across Seoul, one ordinary moment had already begun transforming into an extraordinary rumor. Sometimes the loudest storms arrive beneath perfectly clear skies. Chapter 7. A story looking for a name. Rumors are impatient. Truth is not. A rumor races from one screen to another, growing louder each time it is repeated. Truth prefers to walk. It gathers details. It waits for context. Sometimes. It arrives too late. By Thursday morning, the photograph had traveled far beyond the account that first published it. Entertainment blogs copied it. Discussion forums debated it. Lifestyle influencers speculated about it. Most of the conversations lasted only seconds before attention drifted elsewhere. But a handful of people saw opportunity where others saw gossip. Opportunity had a habit of asking questions. The headquarters of the online publication City Current occupied the 6th floor of an aging office building overlooking the Han River. Unlike Gangnam Tower, nothing here was quiet. Phones rang constantly. Televisions murmured from every wall. Reporters crossed paths carrying cameras, notebooks, and unfinished copies. Information arrived faster than certainty. Sometimes certainty never arrived at all. Choi Min-suk stood before a wall-sized screen displaying the now familiar photograph. His editor folded his arms. Find her. Min-suk remained silent. We're not accusing anyone. The editor continued. We're identifying someone the public already wants to know about. Do they? The numbers say they do. Min-suk looked again at the image. Rain blurred the edges. Headlights reflected across wet asphalt. The faces remained indistinct. It could have been anyone. Which he thought was exactly the point. There isn't enough here. There will be. The editor picked up a printed copy. Start with the sketchbook. An hour later, Min-suk stood once again at the intersection where the photograph had been taken. Morning traffic flowed around him. Cyclists passed. Office workers hurried toward the subway. The crossing looked almost disappointingly ordinary. He raised the printed photograph, compared it to the street before him, then quietly stepped backward until the perspective matched the image. Only then did he notice it. The position of the traffic light, the angle of the cafe window, the missing space where someone else should have been standing. He lowered the photograph. It was cropped. Not manipulated. Simply incomplete. A single decision had removed an elderly gentleman from the frame. One edit. One missing person. An entirely different story. He crossed the street slowly. The owner of the corner cafe greeted him with a polite bow. Coffee? Please. The cafe owner prepared the drink while Min-suk casually placed the photograph on the counter. Were you working during Tuesday's storm? I was. Do you remember these two? The owner adjusted his glasses, then smiled. I remember the rain. He looked more closely. Oh. He pointed to the empty space beside them. There was an old man. Min-suk's eyebrows lifted. You remember him? He comes every Thursday. The cafe owner shrugged. He nearly slipped. Nearly? Those two helped him. He looked puzzled. Why isn't he in the picture? Min-suk looked down at the photograph. Because someone had decided he wasn't useful to the story. Across Gangnam, Studio Hanol prepared for a client presentation. Dress forms lined the workroom. Finished garments waited beneath protective covers. The atmosphere carried the focused excitement that always accompanied an important deadline. Lee Soo-jin walked between workstations offering encouragement more often than instruction. She trusted the people she had hired. That trust showed. Amara adjusted the collar of a tailored jacket before stepping back to study its silhouette. Something felt slightly off. She removed 2 pins. Shifted the shoulder line by less than a centimeter. Suddenly, the garment relaxed. The fabric seemed almost grateful. Park Hyun-woo laughed softly from the next table. I've been watching you. Amara looked up. That's slightly unsettling. He grinned. You listen to fabric. I try. My grandmother used to say cloth complains before people do. She smiled. Mine said almost the same thing. For a moment they simply stood admiring the finished jacket. Not because it was perfect. Because it finally felt honest. At Gangnam Tower, Ji-woo reviewed redevelopment proposals once more. His attention returned repeatedly to Lantern Alley. Independent bookstore. Florist. Ceramics workshop. Family bakery. Small businesses rarely appeared significant inside financial reports. Yet they seemed to matter enormously to the people who visited them. He picked up his pen. Across the top of the proposal, he wrote a single sentence. Preserve the businesses that preserve the neighborhood. Director Han noticed the handwritten note when the folder returned to his desk. He smiled. Some decisions changed balance sheets. Others changed cities. He suspected this one might do both. As evening approached, Choi Min-suk returned to his office carrying a notebook filled with observations instead of accusations. He opened a new document. The cursor blinked patiently. His editor walked past. Anything? Min-suk answered without looking away from the screen. Yes. Good. There's a story. His editor smiled. I knew it. Min-suk nodded slowly. But I don't think it's the one we're chasing. Outside, the last light of day reflected from the windows of Gangnam. Inside Studio Hanul, Amara packed her sketchbook. Inside Kongjin Tower, Ji-woo switched off the lights in his office. Neither knew that somewhere else in the city, a reporter had just discovered that the truth was far more interesting than the rumor. And for the first time, someone had decided that protecting an ordinary life might be more important than publishing an extraordinary headline. Chapter 8. The bookshop after rain. The rain returned 3 evenings later. Not with thunder. Not with urgency. It arrived as a patient mist that softened the edges of the city until every streetlight glowed like a lantern seen through memory. Gangnam slowed again. The cafes filled earlier than usual. Office workers lingered beneath awnings, waiting for weather that none of them truly expected to end anytime soon. The city seemed to breathe more deeply when it rained. Studio Hanul emptied gradually. One designer hurried toward the subway. Another accepted a ride home. Lee Soo-jin closed a portfolio and glanced toward Amara, who stood watching the rain through the tall studio windows. You don't seem to mind it. Amara smiled. I think it reminds me that the world doesn't always have to rush. Soo-jin slipped on her coat. Then Seoul is teaching you something. And what is that? That even vast cities have quiet corners. She smiled warmly. You've already found a few. Lantern Alley welcomed the rain as though it had been expecting it. Paper lanterns shimmered above the narrow stone street. The flower shop moved its chrysanthemums beneath the awning. The ceramic studio fogged gently from the warmth inside. And at the end of the lane, the little bookstore glowed with the familiar amber light that had already begun feeling like home. The brass bell chimed softly. The bookseller looked up from a stack of returned novels. I wondered. Amara laughed. You wondered? If rain would bring you back. It usually does. I suspected. He poured barley tea before she had even removed her coat. Neither of them acknowledged that this had quietly become a tradition. Some friendships begin with introductions. Others begin with remembering how someone takes their tea. She settled beside the rain-speckled window. Her sketchbook opened almost immediately. Tonight, she wasn't drawing buildings. She was drawing hands. Mrs. Park tying string around a parcel. Lee Soo-jin smoothing fabric across a mannequin. The cafe owner polishing a porcelain cup. Hands fascinated her. They revealed habits, lives, histories. The bookseller glanced at the page. You notice people. I try. He smiled. Most people notice faces. I think hands are more honest. The old man nodded thoughtfully. I believe you're right. A few moments later, the brass bell rang again. Another customer entered, folding a large black umbrella with careful precision before placing it inside the stand by the door. He bowed politely. Good evening. Director Seo. The bookseller returned the greeting with an easy smile. You're just in time. For what? The rain. Ji-woo laughed softly. I suppose that's true. He wandered toward the history shelves without noticing the woman seated near the window. Amara, absorbed in her sketch, remained equally unaware of him. The bookstore held its silence gently. It never hurried introductions. The bookseller disappeared into the back room in search of a requested title. For the first time, the front of the shop belonged only to two strangers and the quiet sound of rain against old glass. Ji-woo selected a worn volume on the history of Seoul's neighborhoods. As he turned, he noticed the open sketchbook. Not the drawings. The care with which they had been made. He paused respectfully. You're an artist. Amara looked up. A designer. He nodded. I stand corrected. She smiled. Most people make the same mistake. He held up the history book. I suppose I'm guilty of judging by appearances. She laughed. That's becoming a theme this week. He sensed there was a story behind the sentence. He chose not to ask. Instead, he gestured toward the sketchbook. You draw places. I draw the people who make places worth remembering. The answer lingered between them. He looked down at the book in his hands. I think we're studying the same subject. She tilted her head. How so? You begin with people. He gently touched the cover of the history book. I begin with cities. He smiled. But I suspect neither can exist without the other. The bookseller returned carrying 2 books and, without asking, placed another cup of barley tea beside Ji-woo. I didn't order. I know. The bookseller smiled. Rain has its own menu. All 3 laughed quietly. The sound blended with the rain in a way that made the little shop feel wonderfully insulated from the rest of the city. Outside, headlines continued searching for names. Inside, names hardly seemed important. For nearly an hour they spoke about books, architecture, neighborhoods, and the strange comfort of finding familiar rituals in unfamiliar places. They never discussed careers. They never mentioned Kongjin Group. They never spoke about Studio Hanol. The photograph remained outside with the rain. Eventually the storm softened into a fine mist. Amara closed her sketchbook. I should head home. So should I. Ji-woo gathered his books. The bookseller wrapped each purchase in brown paper, tying every parcel with the same careful knot. As they reached the doorway, the bookseller looked at them with quiet amusement. Cities become smaller when readers walk through them. Neither fully understood what he meant. They simply smiled. Outside, they opened their umbrellas almost in unison. Good night, Ji-woo said. Good night. They walked in opposite directions beneath rows of glowing lanterns. Neither looked back. Not because they lacked curiosity. Because some meetings become meaningful precisely because they are allowed to end without expectation. Behind the bookstore window, the old bookseller watched them disappear into the evening. He had spent 40 years surrounded by stories. He had learned that the best ones rarely began with fireworks. They began with conversation. And the patience to let another chapter arrive in its own time. Chapter 9. A name begins to travel. Most lives change gradually. One season gives way to another. A new habit forms. A friendship deepens. A neighborhood slowly begins to feel like home. Then there are the rare moments when change arrives all at once. Not because life itself has changed. Because someone else has decided to tell your story. Friday morning unfolded with reassuring familiarity. Apartment 401 filled with the aroma of freshly brewed coffee. Across the hallway, Mrs. Park hummed softly while tending the chrysanthemums outside her door. The florist arranged white lilies beneath striped awnings. The cafe owner greeted the same customers he greeted every morning. The city repeated its rituals with comforting precision. Amara loved that about Seoul. It reminded her that belonging was not one grand moment. It was 1,000 ordinary mornings. Studio Hanol was preparing for an important client presentation. Garments rested beneath linen covers. Steam drifted lazily upward from pressing stations. Someone quietly rehearsed a presentation. Another searched frantically for a missing measuring tape that had been hanging around his own neck all morning. The studio laughed. Deadlines had a way of revealing everyone's humanity. Amara found herself laughing too. Only a week ago she had felt like a visitor. Now she was laughing with everyone else. That small difference mattered. Near midday, the receptionist answered another telephone call. Her expression changed almost immediately. "I'm sorry." She listened patiently. "We don't discuss members of our staff." A pause. "No." Another pause. "I'm afraid I can't help you." She ended the call politely, then looked toward Lee Soo-jin. It happened again. Soo-jin set aside the portfolio she had been reviewing. "The same questions?" The receptionist nodded. "They're asking about a woman who carries a sketchbook." A quiet stillness settled over the office. No one else seemed to notice. Machines continued humming. Fabric continued moving through careful hands. Only Soo-jin understood what those questions might become. She walked slowly toward the studio floor. Amara stood beside a mannequin adjusting the fall of a linen sleeve. Completely absorbed. Completely unaware. Soo-jin watched her for several seconds, then smiled to herself. Some people deserved a little more time before the world interrupted them. She turned back toward the receptionist. "If anyone calls again," she lowered her voice, "they speak to me." Across the city, Ji-woo entered a meeting with Kongjin Group's communications department. The atmosphere differed noticeably from previous discussions. More folders. Fewer opinions. One of the analysts placed several printed screenshots on the conference table. "The story continues spreading." Ji-woo glanced through them quietly. None contained new information. Only louder speculation. He closed the folder. "What have we confirmed?" Silence. Finally, someone answered. "Nothing." "And the woman?" "We still don't know who she is." Ji-woo nodded once. "Then we know even less." Several people exchanged uncertain glances. He continued calmly. "No statements. No investigations. No assumptions. If someone is living an ordinary life." He rested both hands lightly on the table. "We are not going to be the reason it becomes extraordinary." Director Han, seated near the end of the table, looked down briefly to hide a small smile. Leadership often revealed itself in the decisions people never noticed. Elsewhere, Choi Min-suk visited the intersection one final time. Not because he expected new evidence. Because he disliked unfinished questions. He studied the traffic patterns. Measured the photographer's likely position. Compared the published image with the physical space once more. The conclusion remained unchanged. The photograph had not lied. It had simply failed to tell the whole truth. Sometimes omission carried as much power as invention. He slipped the photograph back into his notebook, then quietly crossed it out. Not the image. The assignment. Back at Studio Hanol, the client presentation concluded with warm applause. Designs were praised. Ideas discussed. Future collaborations hinted at over coffee. As guests gradually departed, one elderly client lingered before Amara's presentation board. He studied her sketches for several moments before speaking. "You draw people." He smiled. "The way some architects draw buildings." Amara looked surprised. "I'm not sure what that means." "It means." He tapped lightly against one sketch. "You understand that every line has a reason." He bowed politely before leaving. The compliment stayed with her long after he disappeared. Evening settled gently across Gangnam. The bookstore switched on its lanterns. The florist carried unsold flowers indoors. Mrs. Park folded freshly dried laundry while listening to an old radio program. Life remained beautifully ordinary. Until one final email arrived inside the communications office at Kongjin Group. No greeting. No signature. Only a subject line. We know who she is. The assistant stared at the screen. For a long moment, she did nothing. Then she picked up the telephone. Director Seo. Her voice was calm, but only just. I think you need to see this. Outside the great windows of Kongjin Tower, the last light of day disappeared behind the skyline. Somewhere below, Amara Ellis was walking home with a loaf of fresh bread tucked beneath one arm, smiling at the scent drifting from the neighborhood bakery. She had no idea that before the night was over, her name would begin traveling through the city ahead of her. Chapter 10. The photograph has a name. Saturday morning arrived wrapped in brilliant autumn sunlight. It seemed almost impossible that such a beautiful day could carry unwelcome news. Apartment 401 filled with the familiar aroma of coffee. Mrs. Park knocked exactly 3 times. When Amara opened the door, the older woman stood there holding a small cloth bag. Inside were fresh mandarins from her sister's farm. For vitamins. Amara laughed. I think you're determined to keep me alive. Mrs. Park nodded. Yes. The answer was so immediate that they both laughed. Neither woman knew how precious that ordinary laughter would soon become. Studio Hanul felt unusually peaceful. The previous day's presentation had gone well. Designers moved through the workroom with the easy confidence that follows difficult work successfully completed. Someone played soft jazz through the studio speakers. Coffee steamed beside half-finished sketches. Life had settled comfortably into its rhythm. Lee Soo-jin watched her team with quiet satisfaction. Then the receptionist appeared. We have another call. Soo-jin excused herself. She expected another curious blogger, another entertainment website. Instead, the voice introduced itself calmly. This is Kongjin Group Communications. Soo-jin straightened slightly. How may I help you? We believe one of your designers may become the target of unwanted media attention. A long silence followed. We're not asking for information. The caller continued. We're calling because we don't want anyone approaching your staff without warning. Soo-jin glanced through the glass wall toward the studio floor. Amara stood helping a junior designer pin the hem of a jacket. Still smiling. Still completely unaware. Thank you for telling me. It's the right thing to do. The call ended. Soo-jin remained standing for several seconds. Sometimes responsibility arrived disguised as a telephone call. She found Amara arranging fabric samples near the windows. Would you walk with me? They stepped onto the small rooftop terrace overlooking the neighborhood. A gentle breeze carried the scent of roasted coffee and distant ginkgo leaves. For a while, neither woman spoke. Soo-jin rested both hands on the terrace railing. There are moments. She began quietly. When we don't get to choose the stories other people tell about us. Amara looked toward her. The photograph. Soo-jin nodded. It's becoming larger than I hoped. Amara absorbed the words without panic. She had spent the last 2 days thinking. Praying. Remembering her grandmother. I still don't know why. I know. But I think. She smiled sadly. I'm finished asking why. Soo-jin turned toward her. What will you ask instead? Amara looked across the rooftops of Gangnam. Who do I want to be while it's happening? The answer surprised them both. Especially Amara. At Kongjin Tower, Ji-woo stood before the same photograph for what he hoped would be the last time. Except now. There was text beneath it. Amara Ellis. The name looked strangely intrusive, as though it had been placed somewhere it didn't belong. His assistant entered quietly. The communications team has contacted Studio Hanol. Good. We offered assistance. And? They thanked us. He nodded. Nothing more. Nothing less. Sometimes helping meant making sure the right people knew the truth, not taking over their decisions. Late that afternoon, Amara left the studio carrying her sketchbook and a small bag of leftover pastries Lee Soo-jin insisted she take home. The streets felt no different than they had yesterday. Children laughed in the neighborhood park. Cyclists rang cheerful bells as they passed. The florist waved. The cafe owner already had her coffee waiting before she reached the counter. Nothing had changed. Except a young man standing across the street looked at his phone, then at her. Only briefly. Long enough to compare. Their eyes met. He lowered the phone immediately and walked away without saying a word. The moment lasted perhaps 3 seconds. It was enough. Amara understood. Not everyone who recognized her would speak. Some would simply look. For the first time since arriving in Seoul, she felt visible in a way she had never wanted. That evening, Mrs. Park found Amara sitting on the apartment balcony. The sketchbook rested unopened beside her. The older woman carried 2 cups of barley tea. She sat down without asking permission. The silence between them felt familiar now. Comfortable. Mrs. Park finally spoke. When my husband died, Amara turned gently toward her. Everyone looked at me. Another pause. They thought looking. She searched for the English word. Help. She smiled softly. It did not. She placed one weathered hand over Amara's. Only people. She squeezed gently. Help. Amara looked down at their joined hands, then quietly nodded. I think I understand. They sat together as evening settled over Gangnam. No speeches. No promises. Only the quiet certainty that kindness remained stronger than attention. Across the city, Choi Min-suk closed his notebook for the night. He had enough information to write 3 different stories. The gossip story. The corporate story. The human story. He knew which one would attract the fewest clicks. He also knew which one deserved to be written. Outside his office window, lights shimmered across Seoul. Inside apartment 401, another light glowed warmly behind lace curtains. The city knew Amara Ellis's name now. It still knew almost nothing about the woman herself. And perhaps, that was the story worth telling. Chapter 11. Every story begins twice. There is a moment in every life when the world begins telling a story about you. Sometimes the story is true. Sometimes it is not. Either way, you eventually face a choice. Will you spend your life correcting strangers? Or continue becoming the person you were always meant to be? Sunday arrived with clear skies over Gangnam. The neighborhood seemed untouched by the conversations unfolding online. Mrs. Park watered her chrysanthemums. The cafe owner waved to familiar customers. Children laughed in the small park across the street. The bakery sold out of sweet red bean bread before noon. Life, stubbornly and beautifully, continued. Amara opened her sketchbook. Not because she needed to work. Because drawing helped her think. She turned past pages filled with lanterns. Old storefronts. Fabric swatches. Hands. Faces. Then stopped on a blank sheet. For several minutes she simply looked at it. A blank page had always excited her. Today, it frightened her a little. She picked up her pencil anyway. The first line was uncertain. The second steadier. By the 5th. She remembered something her grandmother used to say. You don't begin by knowing the whole pattern. You begin with the first stitch. Amara smiled. Some wisdom never grew old. Across the city, Ji-woo walked alone through Lantern Alley. Not because he expected to meet anyone. Because he needed somewhere quieter than boardrooms and headlines. The bookstore door stood open. The brass bell announced his arrival. The bookseller looked up. You've been away. Only a few days. For readers. The old man smiled. That can be a long time. Ji-woo laughed softly. It has been a busy week. The bookseller poured tea without asking. You've been carrying something heavier than books. Ji-woo looked out the rain-free window. Have you ever wished you could protect someone you've barely met? The bookseller considered the question carefully, then nodded once. Many times. And? I learned something. He placed the tea gently on the table. What was it? You cannot choose another person's road. A pause. But you can make sure they never have to walk it alone. The words settled quietly between them. Ji-woo looked down into the rising steam. He thought of the woman with the sketchbook. He still didn't know her name. Only that she deserved peace. That afternoon, Amara wandered toward Lantern Alley. Not searching for answers. Searching for stillness. The city welcomed her with familiar sights. The florist arranging fresh lilies. The cafe owner polishing cups. Paper lanterns swaying gently above the stone street. She realized something. The neighborhood had not changed. Neither had the people who had welcomed her. Only the noise outside it had grown louder. That realization brought unexpected comfort. She reached the bookstore just as another customer stepped outside carrying a wrapped parcel. Their paths crossed only briefly. Each offered a polite bow. Each continued in opposite directions. Neither recognized the other. The moment lasted no more than a heartbeat. Yet something about it felt strangely familiar. Not enough to stop. Only enough to wonder. Inside the bookstore, the bookseller smiled as Amara approached. You came. I needed somewhere quiet. He nodded knowingly. Quiet is easier to find than people think. He placed a cup of barley tea beside her favorite seat. No words were needed. Outside, sunlight filtered through the lanterns, casting warm patterns across the wooden floor. For the first time in several days, Amara felt herself breathe fully again. Elsewhere in the city, Choi Min-suk pressed delete. The gossip article disappeared from his screen. In its place, he opened a new document. The title was simple. The Cost of Looking Away. He began writing about cropped photographs. About missing context. About the responsibility carried by every person who chooses what to show. And what to leave outside the frame. It would never become the most read article of the week. He decided he could live with that. Evening settled gently across Gangnam. Apartment windows glowed one by one. The first stars appeared above the skyline. Lantern Alley shimmered beneath amber lights. Life resumed its familiar rhythm. Somewhere in Seoul, thousands of people still believed they understood the photograph. They believed they knew the story. They were wrong. The real story had never been about a photograph. It had never been about a rumor. It had never been about curiosity. It was about two ordinary people. A designer searching for a place to belong. A man learning that leadership begins with compassion. Neither knew how deeply their lives would become intertwined. Neither understood that the quiet conversations, shared books, and rain-soaked evenings of this first week were laying the foundation for something neither ambition nor coincidence could have planned. Some stories begin with love. The best stories begin with becoming. And beneath the glowing lights of Gangnam, two strangers had already begun changing one another's lives. Long before either of them realized it. End of episode 1. Continue in episode 2, Reflections in glass.